Hey Kingdom Yogis, welcome to another Christ Yoga in You video. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Arnold. I'm founder of Christ Yoga in You, which is a place for Christian yogis to gather and grow in their faith and their practice. In today's video, I want to take some time to go over an extremely critical concept in yoga, counterposing, that I don't hear a whole lot of people talking about or discussion about. You might be following a teacher and they'll say, well, let's counter with, or they might say, let's enter into the counter pose. But I never had anybody explain that to me when I was practicing. And I find it's like one of the most critical concepts. And this is why it's so, let me go into why it's so critical before I talk about what it is. First off, counterposing is super critical because it is a great safeguard against avoiding injury by overextending or overloading like joints and tissue. It is also, so that's the first thing, it can really go a long way toward mitigating doing something that's going to hurt your body. Number two is it creates balanced development of the body. So you're going to see in a moment where, like when we load a muscle tissue in a counter pose, we'll go and we will load an anterior muscle group opposite of that group, and that's going to create balance in your body, in your posture, in your physique. I mean, that's good stuff. It also is, I think, some of the secret sauce to helping you create your own sequences in a way that's healthier, and you can sequence a lot quicker when you understand counterposing, because you honestly, you start to think in terms of clusters of poses rather than pose by pose by pose. So it helps you sequence better. And when I say better, I mean you can do it, you can create more balanced, healthy poses that create balanced development of your body that are going to keep you safer, and you can think through sequences much quicker than other people if you understand countering really well. And then last but not least, it just feels good, okay? Like if you ever have the misfortune of stepping into a class where somebody doesn't do a decent job of creating counter poses throughout, you will walk out and it is the weirdest, ickiest feeling in your body. You walk, it's just janky. I don't know, like that's not a technical term, that's my technical term I'm gonna throw at it. So it just feels good in our bodies. So just to recap, helps you avoid injury, it's gonna create balanced development of your body, it's going to help you sequence better, and it's gonna make you feel good. Why would you not wanna understand that? So what is it? What is it? Okay, if you go searching the internet, you're gonna find a lot of people who talk about it as neutralizing like a prior pose or creating equilibrium, creating balance. All those things are true, but personally, I don't like to talk about it in those manners, in that manner necessarily. Because when you think about something neutralizing, when you neutralize the effect of something, you kind of undo what you just did. I sort of get mentally where that is coming from, why people would choose that word. But when you do a pose, you do it because you are trying to get certain benefits and you are trying to create a certain response in your body, and you don't want to do away with that, right? So what's a better way of thinking about that? To me, counterposing, it's like when you're putting together a meal and you try to pair the perfect wine with the meal. Right? Like you don't do that so that when you take a sip of the wine, you suddenly forget about and can't, the taste of whatever you just had was neutralized and done away with. You don't have the perfect wine with the meal. I'm not even a wine drinker, so I don't know why I'm saying this, but I think it's an analogy people will get. You don't pick the perfect wine in order to neutralize or undo what you just ate. It's not a palate cleanser, okay? You pick it because you want to draw out the flavor, and both the wine and the meal enhance one another. That's how I want you to think about a counterpose. It's thinking through the dynamic of what you're doing and picking the perfect pair, the perfect wine, if you will, to go with that pose that's going to bring out the best benefits of it. And in the case of yoga, it's also going to mitigate injury or the odds of it. So let's do some examples so you can see and understand why counterposing does all this stuff. In general, when you're trying to figure out what a good counterpose is, you want to think about what muscle is being engaged or being stretched, and you want to allow it a productive pause afterwards. That's another way I like to think about counterposing. So if you're engaged, let's say you're stretching the hamstrings really heavily, what is going to give those hamstrings an opportunity to go, afterwards, right? And to, in the case of stretching, to allow a moment to kind of come back to the place where they were so that we're not going to overextend them by bam, going into something else that's not taking into consideration how much that tissue has been stretched. Or if we had been straining and tightening those hamstrings, we don't want to then continue to throw load on them, or just rapidly move into something disconnected from it, and that muscle is still in a contracted state. We want to counter that with some stretch. So, what are some good examples? Let's take, for example, let's say we are doing a really deep straddle bend, right? So, if we're got our legs out wide and we're moving in deep into this, where are we mostly feeling that? We're feeling it all through here, right? We're maybe feeling it a little bit in our lower back or a lot in our lower back, depending on where we tend to be tight. So a good counterpose would be something that's going to take the load off of this, and now it's going to stretch this. You want to stretch the opposite muscle for that balanced development. That's what makes it the perfect pairing. And we want to give that moment, that back a moment of rest as well before we go into something else. So we might lean back on our hands. That's going to immediately take some of the load off here. It's going to put the back in kind of a neutral position after having been arched over deeply, maybe even bend back a little bit. We might bring the feet up and then draw this knee over. Now what's happening the moment we draw this knee over? We're now stretching this outer, what we might call the anterior muscle groups. We're going to stretch that, and we're going to just relax this. And all this that was being stretched out is now in a contracted state, contracted in that the tension's been taken off of it, and it's just kind of drawn together positionally. It's not that we're tightening it together. And then we come over this way. And do you see how that would create balanced development? Because we're stretching this muscle after stretching this muscle. You want to do that because if you don't do that, and one muscle group is more limber than the other, it's going to create a tension and a load on that other muscle that is going to cause it to cramp up. Perfect example is people sitting in a desk all day doing this, and this tissue becomes contracted and it doesn't have the same flexibility as what's going on in the back because the back's rounded over. And sitting up straight like this can actually be painful for someone who sits like this all day. The key to relieving a lot of upper back pain doesn't even have anything to do with stretching the back muscle. Sometimes it has everything to do with stretching the opposite muscle to create balanced development in the body, to counter it, if you will. You see how those are like perfect complements? It's not about undoing, but enhancing, getting the most out of what you did by being sure that your body's developed in a balanced way. So times people are only thinking about counterposing positionally. They'll think about it, by that I mean like, what is the exact opposite of what I just did? And to some degree, that is a helpful way to think about it. Now, if you are doing something fairly extreme as a pose or a bend, or a stretch, I think it's helpful to do something interim and not go to the opposite extreme. It's just my personal preference. People do it all the time. I think it's better on the body to ease your way into a counterpose, particularly if you're counting something that was really demanding. I'll give you an example. This is one from my own practice. Let's say you're doing something like camel pose, right? And in camel, all of this is being stretched and contracted, and the lower back is being compressed a lot, and the chest is being opened up, and all of that stuff is highly, highly, highly engaged. It's a pretty extreme back bend. You can't get much more extreme other than to go on the ground, do bow, or do a wheel pose, right? So, now if you just thought about this positionally and you said, what's the opposite of this? Like totally rounding over the back, standing up and doing a forward fold, or maybe going into child's pose would be sort of the positional opposite. That wouldn't be entirely bad, but if I go straight from this into a child's pose, I find my lower back will really kind of ache when I do that. So I like to move my way into the counter pose by doing something that's kind of agnostic in the middle, okay? Something that's not demanding one way or the other. So I might go to downward dog. I go to down dog. This now is not stretched at all the way that it was. In fact, I might even bend the knees just a little bit, or I might go engage the glutes and the hamstrings quite a bit more to allow it to relax some. My back's not, it's no longer arched. It's in a neutral position. I still have a fair bit of load on my shoulders, but it's on the front of my body, not the back of my body. So there's a lot of things that are the opposite here, but not heavily. It's more pretty neutral. But then I would go from that into, say, a child's pose. But I probably wouldn't, I won't say probably wouldn't, I don't typically go straight from one to the other. If I'm going from a fairly extreme pose, I'm going to take something neutral in the beginning. Another thing to think about, like for example, let's say you were doing a forward fold like so. All of this is being lengthened in the back of the body. The muscles being stretched. It's not being loaded per se in terms of contracting. It's being stretched. You know, I might afterwards, if you had the physical ability to do so, you might do an opposite, a reverse plank, or what may be more accessible to many people would be to do a tabletop. And now I'm engaging completely opposite muscles. A strong, something where we're strongly, maybe we've done like a bridge pose. And now this is not, it's a little bit positional, but this is more thinking about the dynamic of what's going on. All of the core is engaged. Now positionally, not a huge difference, but if I want the core to just be allowed to relax, I could bring knees to chest, holding my knees in, letting the head rest, and just allowing the core to be at ease and the back gently stretched after having been contracted. And these are nice, really nice, gentle counters. So I hope you get the idea. If you got questions about something specific where you go, hey, I don't know how to counter that, I'll do my best to answer it. If not, I got a zillion yoga teacher buddies who I'm sure one of them would jump in and say, oh, here's one of my favorite counter poses. Last but not least, don't only think in terms of countering pose to pose. I think about it holistically when I'm creating a whole sequence or a practice. So for example, let's say One approach to creating sequencing is what's called a peak pose approach, where you're building up to kind of a pinnacle pose, a pose that is the pose you're aiming for, and then you're coming back down. When I was learning mermaid, and I can't do it anymore. I actually have to rework my way back into that. I've lost some flexibility since when I was learning that pose. But it takes some back flexibility, it takes some hamstring, some quadricep flexibility, and I would do multiple poses, warming the spine and stretching the top of the hamstring, and not countering a lot on the front end. I was mostly warming. I would do that pose, but then afterwards, because I'd spent so much time on that, I would be doing lots of forward folds, lots of stretching of the hamstring, lots of stretching of my hips. I've been kind of sedentary in that thing. So I think you get the idea. It wasn't pose to pose necessarily, but throughout the course of my practice, I made sure, after spending so much time getting a particular muscle group ready to do something, that I tried to spend a fairly equivalent amount of time on the back end, giving that stuff a break and working the opposite muscles for that balanced development. Okay, I hope this has been really helpful. I would love some of my yoga teacher buddies to chime in here, because I really don't hear a lot of people talking about this, and it is, in my mind, one of the most critical concepts to understand in terms of sequencing and sequencing well. If you like this type of instruction, I really would like to do more with folks on helping them sequence well. Please let me know that you're interested in learning how to create your own sequences, and I will put more videos out like this. All right, I need to go do my practice now for the evening and call it a day. You all have a blessed week. I look forward to seeing you in another video, and until then, I hope you live a fit, a faithful, and an epic life for the Lord. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Blessings, friends. Hey, I just wanted to take a moment and thank you for practicing with me today. I always love connecting with more Christian yogis. There's actually probably a lot more out there than you realize. If you want to connect with us in a more personal way, go over to a Facebook group, Christ Yoga and You. Just search for it. I'll let you in there. It would be awesome to meet you. If you want to get more support in doing yoga daily, I put together a guide that breaks down like just 7 steps to keeping up a consistent practice. I've got over 1,600 days, so I can tell you from experience that it works. Again, thanks so much for being here, and I look forward to seeing you in another video. Until then, I would encourage you to live a fit, a faithful, a really epic life for the Lord, my fellow Kingdom Yogi. I'll see you again soon. Blessings.